The BRICS nations are calling for reforms that more accurately reflect the economic realities of the 21st century. They argue that current structures, such as the IMF and WTO, disproportionately benefit wealthier countries and fail to adequately address the needs of the global South. These nations are pushing for changes, including a revision of the IMF's quota system to give emerging economies greater influence, as well as restoring the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism to its full capacity. As a result, the global South is increasingly committed to overhauling the existing Western-centric financial system, and is even considering the creation of alternative institutions to better meet its needs. In this video, we explore the roots of widespread dissatisfaction with the IMF, and examine the impacts of IMF-backed loans in various global South nations, where they have often had disastrous consequences for citizens and the economy. Let's dive in. Brazil's crisis and IMF involvement. In the late 1990s, Brazil faced a severe economic crisis and turned to the IMF for assistance in stabilizing its currency and economy. In November 1998, the IMF approved a $41.5 billion support package, contingent upon Brazil implementing harsh austerity measures and structural reforms aimed at reducing fiscal deficits and ensuring economic stability. These measures included deep cuts to public spending, higher taxes, and public sector reforms. As a result, Brazil's government slashed funding for essential services like healthcare, education, and social security, negatively impacting accessibility and quality, particularly for vulnerable and low-income groups. Public outrage was widespread, with citizens and labor unions criticizing the IMF's conditions, claiming they exacerbated poverty and inequality. Protests and strikes erupted, and critics argued that the focus on fiscal austerity hindered economic growth and social progress, increasing unemployment and civil unrest. Despite this, some believe the austerity and reforms were necessary to stabilize Brazil's economy, curb hyperinflation, restore investor confidence, and pave the way for future growth. Brazil's early repayment of its IMF loans in 2005 under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is often seen as a symbol of the country's regained financial sovereignty. However, debate continues over the social costs of the IMF's austerity measures, highlighting the challenge of balancing economic reform with social welfare. Indonesia's crisis and IMF austerity. In the late 1990s, Indonesia was severely impacted by the Asian financial crisis, facing a sharp depreciation of its currency, soaring inflation, and widespread economic turmoil. In October 1997, President Suharto's government secured a $43 billion bailout from the IMF. The austerity measures that followed sparked massive public outrage, and by May 1998, nationwide protests escalated into violent riots in Jakarta and other cities. Protesters targeted symbols of affluence and power, leading to widespread property destruction and looting. Much of the violence was directed at the Chinese Indonesian community. The government responded with military force to restore order, resulting in numerous fatalities, with some estimates placing the death toll above 1,000. The crisis and its IMF-driven austerity measures severely eroded public trust in Suharto's leadership, eventually leading to his resignation on May 21, 1998, after 31 years in power. The events of 1998 marked the beginning of Indonesia's reformasi era, characterized by democratic reforms and greater governmental transparency. However, the impact of the crisis and IMF-imposed austerity left a lasting legacy on Indonesian society, shaping public attitudes toward international financial institutions and influencing economic policies for years to come. Egypt's bread riots and IMF austerity. In January 1977, Egypt experienced widespread civil unrest, known as the bread riots, following the government's decision to cut subsidies on key food items. This move, intended to secure financial support from entities like the IMF, led to immediate and sharp price hikes on staples such as bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil. These price increases sparked protests across major cities, including Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez, as citizens struggled to afford essential goods. These riots and the subsequent social unrest marked a pivotal moment in Egypt's history, drawing attention to the deep economic disparities exacerbated by IMF-backed austerity measures. The unrest demonstrated the potential social consequences of the IMF's policies, which prioritize fiscal stabilization at the expense of public welfare. In each of these cases, the social and economic fallout from IMF-backed reforms highlights the tensions between global financial institutions and the needs of the global South. As these countries continue to advocate for greater influence and more equitable financial structures, the lessons from these crises underscore the urgent need for reform within the international economic system. The unrest that unfolded in early 1977 began on January 18th, when workers in industrial areas such as Helwan launched strikes and protests. These actions soon gained momentum, with students and other citizens joining in. The protests escalated, with participants voicing their opposition to government policies and economic strategies. Tensions grew as demonstrators targeted symbols of authority and wealth, including police stations, government buildings, and luxury hotels. Public transportation also became a target, leading to widespread property damage. On January 20th, President Anwar Sadat deployed the military to restore order, which led to violent clashes, resulting in around 80 deaths, more than 550 injuries, and nearly 1,200 arrests. Faced with mounting pressure, the government reversed its decision to cut subsidies, which helped quell the unrest. In May 1981, Morocco faced a severe economic crisis, characterized by a large budget deficit and rising external debt. To address these issues, King Hassan II's government reached an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which required austerity measures, particularly the removal of subsidies on essential food items like flour, sugar, oil, milk, and butter. This caused prices to surge, flour by 40%, sugar by 50%, oil by 28%, milk by 14%, and butter by 76%. The rapid increase in food prices ignited widespread protests, culminating in the Casablanca bread riots on May 9, 1981. Thousands of impoverished citizens took to the streets, targeting symbols of wealth such as banks, pharmacies, grocery stores, and luxury vehicles. The government responded swiftly, with police and military forces opening fire on the protesters. Official reports put the death toll at 66, while opposition sources claimed it was as high as 637, with many victims being young people from slum areas. The violent suppression of these protests left lasting social and political consequences. This period underscored the risks of implementing austerity measures in a society reliant on subsidized goods, and highlighted the tension between international financial demands and the socio-economic realities of Morocco's population. By the mid-1980s, Nigeria faced a severe economic downturn, marked by falling oil revenues, increasing external debt, and shrinking foreign reserves. Under General Ibrahim Babangida, Nigeria initiated a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in July 1986, designed with the IMF to diversify the economy beyond oil, encourage non-oil industries, and achieve fiscal balance. However, the program caused immediate hardships for Nigerians. The devaluation of the currency led to inflation, raising the cost of imported goods and essential items. The removal of subsidies made life even harder for low-income citizens. Public discontent grew, leading to the anti-SAP riots from May to June 1989. Protests began on May 24th at the University of Benin, where students carried a mock coffin and green leaves, chanting slogans like "SAP must go" and "SAP is a vampire." The movement spread nationwide, uniting students, workers, and other groups in major cities such as Lagos, Ibadan, and Benin City. Violent clashes with security forces followed, and the government deployed the military to suppress the protests. The economy contracted, unemployment rose, and public services deteriorated, further deepening poverty and inequality. The government's harsh response to dissent further destabilized the political environment, eroding public trust in leadership. While some argued that the economic reforms were necessary for Nigeria's long-term stability, the immediate social costs were significant. This era serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of implementing austerity measures dictated by external institutions without adequate social protections. In February 1989, Venezuela was hit by a sharp decline in oil revenues and a rising external debt, plunging the country into a serious economic crisis. In response, President Carlos Andrés Pérez introduced IMF-recommended austerity measures, known as El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn, aimed at restoring economic stability through structural reforms. However, these policies sparked widespread outrage. On February 27, 1989, protests erupted in Guarenas near Caracas following bus fare hikes. The unrest quickly spread to Caracas and other urban areas, escalating into large-scale demonstrations, riots, and looting, collectively called El Caracazo. In response, President Pérez declared a state of emergency and suspended constitutional rights, deploying military forces to suppress the revolt. Violence ensued, with the official death toll reported at 277, though independent estimates suggest it could have been between 2,000 and 5,000, mostly at the hands of security forces. This brutal crackdown shattered public trust in traditional politics, paving the way for the rise of Hugo Chavez, who would later leverage the discontent to lead a failed coup in 1992 and eventually become president in 1998. El Caracazo became a turning point in Venezuela's history, exposing deep social divides and the volatile consequences of abrupt economic reforms. Since 1988, Pakistan has frequently entered agreements with the IMF, which have required austerity measures and subsidy cuts to address fiscal shortfalls and achieve economic balance. These measures have often led to significant public hardship, sparking protests and political instability. The early IMF programs in Pakistan involved structural adjustments, including subsidy cuts and currency devaluation, which raised prices on essential goods, adversely impacting low-income groups and igniting public unrest. Under President Pervez Musharraf, Pakistan secured nearly $2 billion in IMF loans, which further necessitated austerity measures, reducing government spending and cutting subsidies. This intensified public hardship, resulting in protests and political upheaval. Opposition to IMF-backed reforms has been a persistent issue in Pakistan. For example, in October 2024, the government raised taxes by 40% as part of an IMF bailout agreement, prompting large-scale protests. Critics argue that these austerity measures have exacerbated inflation and unemployment, highlighting the challenges of balancing international financial obligations with domestic socio-economic realities. Supporters of public services argue that such reforms are essential for achieving long-term fiscal stability and addressing inherent economic challenges. In the 1990s, Kenya implemented structural adjustment programs, SAPs, recommended by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank to address financial issues such as deficits and sluggish growth. These programs required significant reforms, including the privatization of state-owned enterprises and the reduction of public spending. As part of these reforms, the government sold off numerous state-owned businesses in an attempt to improve efficiency and alleviate budgetary pressures. By late 1995, Kenya had privatized over 100 entities, including 43 factories, which were transferred to farmers, and reduced its stakes in major corporations, such as Kenya Airways and Kenya Commercial Bank. In an effort to consolidate the national budget, government spending was cut in critical sectors such as health and education, leading to the introduction of user fees. These fees made services that were once subsidized more expensive, further burdening the public. However, the expected economic recovery from these SAPs failed to materialize. Between 1991 and 1993, Kenya experienced its worst economic performance since independence, with stagnant GDP and a 3.9% annual decline in agricultural output. The reduction in public spending and the elimination of subsidies had a disproportionate impact on low-income communities, exacerbating poverty and inequality. User fees for healthcare and education further restricted access for poorer populations, resulting in worse health outcomes and declining educational achievements. Public frustration, fueled by the socio-economic hardships caused by these reforms, led to protests and political unrest. Many Kenyans believe the programs were imposed externally and were poorly suited to the country's needs, undermining trust in both the domestic government and international financial institutions. Experts have criticized the SAPs for exacerbating Kenya's structural problems, noting that rapid privatization and austerity measures, without adequate social safety nets, worsened unemployment and underemployment. Moreover, the focus on market liberalization overlooked the need for strong institutions, which left the country vulnerable to market failures and corruption. Now let's examine why countries, including BRICS members, have become dissatisfied with the IMF. The IMF has faced significant criticism from countries in the global south for its lending practices and policy recommendations. One major point of contention is the structural adjustment programs implemented during the 1980s and 1990s. These programs emphasized austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization, which were meant to stabilize economies and promote growth. However, they often resulted in negative consequences, including cuts in public spending for essential services like healthcare and education, disproportionately affecting disadvantaged groups. Additionally, the focus on export-led growth exposed developing economies to global market fluctuations, leading to overproduction and falling commodity prices, which worsened poverty and inequality. Another concern is the erosion of national sovereignty, as the IMF often imposes economic policies through conditionalities tied to loans. Critics argue that this external intervention limits a country's ability to pursue development strategies that suit its unique socio-economic context and priorities, often prioritizing the interests of wealthier creditor nations over those of the borrowing countries. The governance structure of the IMF has also been criticized for favoring developed economies. Voting power is based on a quota system tied to a country's financial contributions, giving wealthier nations more influence and marginalizing developing countries. Efforts to reform this system have been slow, perpetuating the perception that the IMF operates as a neo-colonial institution. The IMF's approach to debt restructuring has also faced scrutiny. Critics argue that it provides insufficient relief and fails to address the root causes of financial crises. Without a fair global legal framework, debtor nations are often trapped in cycles of borrowing and repayment, hindering sustainable development and prolonging economic stagnation. The IMF's fiscal consolidation strategies, which often include slashing public spending on vital services such as healthcare and education, are seen as detrimental to long-term progress. These cuts worsen outcomes for disadvantaged communities, further widening social inequalities. These critiques highlight the complex relationship between the IMF and countries in the global south, underscoring the need for reforms that promote inclusive growth while respecting national sovereignty. In response, the BRICS countries have been working to create alternative financial mechanisms to reduce reliance on institutions like the IMF. Established in 2015, the New Development Bank, NDB, focuses on funding infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging economies. With an initial capital of $100 billion, the NDB offers financing without the stringent conditions often attached to IMF loans, giving member countries more flexibility in pursuing their development goals. Additionally, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, launched in 2015, provides financial support to BRICS members facing short-term balance of payments pressures. With a total capital of $100 billion, the CRA acts as a financial safety net, offering an alternative to IMF assistance programs. At the 16th BRICS Summit in October 2024, held in Kazan, Russia, member nations proposed several initiatives to enhance financial cooperation and reduce dependence on Western-dominated systems. One proposal, the BRICS Grain Exchange, aims to stabilize food prices and improve food security by facilitating direct trade in agricultural commodities among BRICS countries, bypassing existing global exchanges that are often influenced by Western financial systems. While experts acknowledge the potential of this initiative, they also note that it may take years to become operational. In addition, BRICS leaders endorsed the creation of a cross-border payment system to facilitate trade among member countries and reduce reliance on the US dollar. This system, known as BRICS Pay, will enable transactions in local currencies, enhancing financial sovereignty and contributing to a more balanced international monetary system. That concludes this video. Thank you for watching. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you found this content inspiring or informative, please consider liking and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support is invaluable. Feel free to explore another video from our channel, now displayed on the screen.